Thanks a lot. I'm having a terrific time at this conference. I've never been here before, and hope you guys are having a good time too. Want to thank the organizers and the guys and women that read the papers, and all the volunteers and stuff like that, and the sponsors. It's just a great thing. So I'm delighted to see all you people here, and I mean a lot of people here for this hour of the morning. And I'm a little surprised that you're all here instead of at the beach, where, you know, I'm sure it's a lot more fun. And I'm only partly kidding about that. I mean, the title of the talk is Hunting Government Backdoors, not like announcing new ones. If I was announcing new ones, you know, I'd feel entitled to this kind of an audience. But no, this is really more about the journey. I'm going to talk about some of the ones I've tried to bring to light, others have brought to light over the last decade or so. But it's really more about the journey and where it goes from here. I think there is a substantial point to talking about that, though, for journalists and for researchers like yourselves, government officials, executives, and regular people who I think ought to be pretty interested in this if they aren't already. There is some point, as I said, in going back over what we've learned and thinking about what we still don't know and thinking about how we did figure out what we know. And with that, hopefully we can figure out how to start figuring out the rest of it. So bear with me, but this is a sort of a long arc here that we're trying to get to, where we find out more about this stuff. Just a level set on the slides. I'm not really a visual person. I was 200, Deviant had 200 slides. I'm going to have 18, and they're really great for resting your eyes if you want someplace to look other than me. But they are not the foundation of this talk. They're just illustrations. That's just the way it is. So sorry about that. So who I am and why I'm here, my name is Joe Menn. My byline is Joseph, and I've got the profound good fortune to be working as an investigative journalist at a solvent company, which is something that I wanted to do when I was in high school 5 years ago, or 10, okay, 35. It's a wonderful, privileged job. And with that, especially if you're at a large media company that is solvent, I think there's a lot of responsibility. So with that in mind, I'd like to ask your indulgence for the first part of this talk as I talk a little bit about the ethics of choosing to report on this stuff. I don't usually hear a lot about ethics at security cons, and my best guess is that it's because ethics are kind of squishy and knowledge isn't. And everybody has their own ethics, and it's pretty hard as a general rule to convince somebody that their ethics are wrong and your ethics are right. So instead, people just try to pass on knowledge and let people do what they want with the information. I don't really disagree with any of that, but having covered tech security since 1999, I feel like one of the tricky bits of the industry is that there isn't a lot of discussion, and there's something of a vacuum, or at least a DMZ, when it comes to ethical issues. There's no course on ethics that I know of that's required of most computer science majors or EE majors, and for that matter, there's no EE major or computer science major that's required for success in security. So even if it was required, I'm not sure what instruction folks would get. And I sometimes wish that there was, therefore, some kind of like a 1-800 ethical, like a hotline. Not so a hacker researcher with a question could get the answer right away from some great guru, but to help facilitate a discussion about it for those who aren't used to it. I'm digressing here, but I just want to give you a general alert that I take morality seriously. And before I get into a talk about finding backdoors that involve some pretty heavy issues, I'm gonna frame it in moral terms. My day job is as a technology projects reporter at Reuters, which is one of the oldest and largest and the single most global news organization on the planet, and one committed to journalistic integrity and independence. That said, I'm here today in my personal capacity, as the saying goes. I previously worked for the Financial Times, for the Los Angeles Times for 10 years, Bloomberg back when nobody had heard of Bloomberg, and before that, the Charlotte Observer in North Carolina, where I started out in North Carolina back when, in Gastonia, back when budding reporters started out covering small-town cops instead of going directly to some, website without any editors. I've also written 3 books, 2 of which are at least partly about the security world. All the Rave, The Rise and Fall of Sean Fanning's Napster. A lot of people don't realize that Sean Fanning was a hacker, and he got a lot of help from other hackers. So that's one aspect of that book. And then probably the more relevant one is that one, Fatal System Error, which is a deep dive into organized Russian cybercrime and its partial protection by the government there. That book is structured around the true adventures of a private American security whiz and a Welsh police detective who teamed up to identify, catch, and get prosecuted 3 mid-level denial-of-service attack extortionists in Russia who were attacking Western companies. And they were eventually sent away to 8 years in Russian prison. If you know much about Russian jurisprudence, you will know that that is an extremely rare occurrence, even now. Despite a narrative that includes hookers, guns, and drugs, it ended up on the official published reading list of the U.S. Strategic Command and was compared by the New Yorker magazine to the novels of Stieg Larsson, the girl who kicked the Hornet's Nest series. I'm giving you a little detail on that book, not merely because it makes a great gift, but also because I want to stress to you that I'm an equal opportunity reporter. I know that my work on Fatal System Error made Russian intelligence concerned enough to have me tailed when I was over there. The Federal Security Service, or FSB, also directed the Interior Ministry, or MVD, not to speak to me on the grounds that I was probably a US spy. In addition, I'm one of the many reporters who've written deeply about Chinese government-supported hacking. One of my pieces from late last year revealed that Microsoft investigators looking into the hijacking of Hotmail accounts belonging to journalists, human rights attorneys in China, Tibetans and Uyghurs abroad, had been hijacked by the mainland government, although Microsoft's most senior leaders elected not to announce that fact, or for that matter, warn the victims. So I want to be clear. Although most of the reporting on Backdoors that I've done thus far has been about what has gone on in the United States, that is not because I have it in for the United States. I'm interested in all backdoors, and I think government backdoors are especially interesting because they are forged in the name of the people. I've done the most work on US backdoors because that is what I've found the most information about. I do think it is possible for US journalists to do good work on Russian or Chinese backdoors, but it is usually easier to report about the goings-on where you live. And I think there is also a moral obligation to do so if you can. I'm willing to entertain an argument that says the Chinese can't write critical things about the Chinese government, and the Russians would be well advised not to write critical things about the Russian government, and therefore American journalists would be of the most use writing critical things about those governments rather than beating up on our own, which after all allows the most freedom of the 3. But I would be more receptive to that argument if I and my peers had not already spilled so much ink and slaughtered so many electrons talking about the cyber horrors of Russia and China before it emerged in fairly dramatic fashion that we were the cyberiest of them all. Though it now seems that everyone is pretty much doing everything they can get away with on the internet, the US is in the awkward position of being first and best, with the most structural advantages and the most vulnerability all at once. Is it ethical to seek to uncover one's own government's backdoors? It's a fair question. I'm not an absolutist, but I'd like to start with the words of inventor, philanthropist, and college founder Emil Faber. Knowledge is good. Here's how I approach the issue. First, if I can find out about it, there's an excellent chance that a rival government can find out about it, if not a malicious hacker. This part is similar to the consensus of the security community in finding bugs and disclosing them responsibly. For a bunch of iconoclastic, authority-defying, and somewhat antisocial creatures, there is something awfully close to unanimity in the belief that it is a good thing to find software flaws warn the vendor, and then warn the public. Of course, some will sell the information for money to private or government buyers. Everyone has to make a living. But almost nobody I can think of, outside perhaps certain FBI officials, believe it's morally wrong to warn people about flaws. The next question is to what extent government backdoors are a kind of flaw. Again, some people would barely recognize this as a question. I'm not one of them. What if it is installed only in an obscure piece of gear, manufactured outside of America and sold entirely overseas, and let's say it's marketed especially to violent extremists? If that sounds too far-fetched, please Google Mujahideen secrets. I can wait. M-U-J-A-H-I-D-E-E-N. If at least some of you agree that that's a valid target for a backdoor, and perhaps one that researchers and journalists shouldn't be falling all over themselves to expose, let's look at the opposite extreme. Perhaps something crafted here and widely used here and abroad, say Google Chrome or Gmail, iOS, Windows, Facebook, and so on. I've been dealing with spies and ex-spies and spy contractors and spy helpers for more than a decade. One thing I've heard from several of them is that even when something looks all-purpose, it is not. For example, say there's a piece of code hidden inside of an operating system that will work as a beacon for US intelligence, but only when something else happens, such as visiting a specific website with another bit of code. Then there's a secret handshake and the game is on. This may limit the number of targets and incidental surveillance subjects. It may even do so in ways that conform with the judgments of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, which interprets FISA. Maybe it even gets us close enough to the Mujahideen secrets example that most people in this room wouldn't have an issue with it. But there are still a couple of problems. First, if the self-imposed backdoor restrictions limit the targeting to, say, anyone IP geomapped to be probably outside our country, that may be good enough by intelligence agency standards and the court that oversees them. It's hard to know, but the FISA court does not block any surveillance of non-US persons on the grounds that the American Constitution is for Americans. Well, that may be correct as a matter of law. That's not much comfort if you're not an American, which is most of the world. And now that they know this is happening, it's a big problem for Microsoft, Google, and all the other companies with the majority of their business elsewhere. Second, about those self-imposed limitations. My spooky contacts tell me that the back door has half of a playing card, and the other half gets supplied by another someone or something. I'm sure that's what happens at least some of the time. But if you used to give anonymous intelligence sources the benefit of the doubt 10 years ago, do you still? Or given that they used to say they did not collect information about Americans under oath before Congress, has the burden of proof shifted a little bit in your mind? Third, I said multiple sources have told me the self-limiting story, but there's also evidence in the other direction. I've heard from one source that a large chip maker was asked to put in a backdoor and declined. I've heard from a second source that a large antivirus vendor was asked to put in a backdoor and declined. I have heard from a third source that a large PC maker was asked to put in a backdoor and agreed. And Nico Sell, founder of the messaging app Wicker, says she was asked if she would allow a backdoor as well. None of those 4 cases included any caveats about it working only in Afghanistan or only for convicted felons or anything like that. And of course, if we looked at the backdoors that have already come to light, they too appear to be all-purpose. The first time I reported in depth about a backdoor was 10 years ago in 2006. I've never spoken in public about this before. The New York Times had reported the previous December, the end of 2005, that the NSA was eavesdropping on some hundreds of international phone calls and emails without a warrant. Within weeks, a colleague and I, the LA Times, wrote that the NSA also had access to all domestic calling records. That is, the metadata that eventually outraged everyone when USA Today, and then aided by Snowden, The Guardian reported the same thing. Back then, after that story appeared, I got a tip that it was bigger than that the NSA controlled access to a room in the AT&T building on Folsom Street in San Francisco, room 641A, that received a perfect copy of all fiber optic traffic flowing through that hub, which was the city's largest. That's the room there. I was one of the first people to see that photograph. Eventually, I would get schematic drawings illustrating the diversion, the whistleblower on the record, former coworkers corroborating his account, and current and former administration officials confirming that they collected data in this way. Although at the time, it was still widely believed that the NSA did not collect information on Americans. If some of you are familiar with the story but don't recall the LA Times breaking it, it is because we didn't. The editor of the newspaper took a call from Michael Hayden, the former NSA chief turned deputy director of national intelligence, and then he spiked the story. The contents of that phone call were off the record, so I will not describe them here. But when it later came out that the LA Times had decided not to run what had proved to be a very significant story, the editor of the paper was quoted as saying that we did not have a complete understanding of what happened to the data collected in that room. Interestingly, that is still in dispute. The whistleblower, AT&T retiree Mark Klein, gave his account to the Electronic Frontier Foundation for its use in 2 lawsuits, one against the company and one against the NSA. One of those 2, Jewel versus NSA, is still pending, if you can believe that. One might hope that such a fundamental issue as whether the largest private telecom in the country can turn over everything it has to a setup arranged by an intelligence agency charged with avoiding US snooping would be something that could be fast-tracked for a resolution. Kind of important, right? But there was the lack of standing argument that the plaintiffs could not show that they had personally been eavesdropped on or otherwise harmed, and the trustee state secrets dodge. And then there was the sweeping amnesty passed by Congress, which Obama was against before he was for, and that ended the suit against AT&T. In truth, my editor was right 10 years ago when he said we didn't know exactly what happened with the AT&T data, and we still don't know now. Room 641A could be what we now see as classic upstream collection, as the Snowden documents called it. But for all we know, the phone company keeps everything and only hands over metadata or information from specific accounts called out by the FISA court. Or maybe it all goes to Maryland and only a certain number of people can troll through it for contact chaining, going out what used to be 3 hops and is now 2 hops from a terror suspect. We don't know for sure. Maybe the legal process in Jewel versus NSA will ultimately tell us the answer, and maybe it will not. The point is, it's pretty interesting. I believe it should be reported. Given the convoluted and often unknowable chain of custody involved in these sorts of issues, I've come to the conclusion that backdoors are backdoors, whatever they are collecting. Which brings me to another recurring theme. Who is doing the collecting? Philosophically, most of the security community probably agrees that all backdoors are bad, maybe unless it's one of their own shortcuts for remote support. And again, it can often be unknowable exactly what's going on. But as with targeting, I think there's a continuum. If undocumented access that circumvents security is a reasonable definition of a backdoor, then a tech support loophole is arguably the least worst. Then there's the more general purpose corporate access, like the Sony Digital Rights Management rootkit debacle, not to be confused with any of the other Sony security debacles. Organized or independent hackers leaving themselves a means back in are probably worse than that. Another country having access to all customers of product X is very hard to distinguish from that, but arguably worse still. And then there's the question of, would I put my own country's backdoor as worse than all of those, say using an American company to spy on Americans? Like an annoying number of answers, I think it depends. As a threat to an individual, it actually depends wildly. If I were in an extremely repressive place and I was a bit of a dissident, I would rather have the Americans spy on me than my own government. If I were in a nice, friendly democracy, I might rather have my own government spy on me than the Americans. If I'm literally talking about myself, it depends what I'm reporting on and therefore like what day of the week it is. But which is the bigger global problem, your own government or someone else's? Well, if it's another government doing it, then your government can protect you if it wants to. If it's your government doing it, then there's nobody who can protect you. That's one reason that I think that these sort of own goals might be the biggest fish to catch. And the other has to do with opacity. An industry truism is that security through obscurity fails in the end, because it will eventually be worth someone's time to plumb the depths and discover the truth. At this point, we expect country A to attack company B. It's in the nature of scorpions to sting. But what about country B attacking company B? Attacking or seducing or hiring? That's obscure in this country, and I think it's pretty obscure in every country, and therefore it's worthwhile exploring. Companies are stuck in this intersection, actually a couple of intersections. They're stuck between customers worldwide and various governments, as well as between democracy and the needs of a capitalist entity to make money. They're responsible to their shareholders and to some extent accountable to their customers, but they're pressed more often by subtle and unsubtle pressure from the governments that come in infinite variations. If Satan were to appear on Earth, and that's assuming that he hasn't already, it would be smart for him to do it through Microsoft and Apple and Disney and Coca-Cola, and it would be up to us to figure out what was going on. So if you agree with me that all backdoors need exposure, no matter what they are or who takes it, how do we find out where they are? Usually we don't. That's one of the bigger lessons that Ed Snowden brought us from Hawaii, and all the more reason that when we do find one, it has a lot of instructive value. As you know, there have been a great many stories based on the Snowden documents, covering all manner of things. As an aside, and I don't mean to sound ungrateful for the information, but a majority of the published documents have been about NSA techniques and capabilities. If you accept the fact that your country is going to have an intelligence agency, you will probably want them to have pretty awesome capabilities. I think more important questions are how they got those capabilities, and even more important than that, what they do with them. And I wish we'd had more stories on that so far. I think we haven't, in part because of access limitations, what Snowden and others could see, and in part because the agencies have been reluctant to explain very much on those points. There's been something of an exception with the phone calling database, the CDRs, calling records, because that stoked a lot of initial alarm. And on the way to some fairly substantial changes, some of the most substantial changes post-Snowden in the law, we learned a lot about how this was actually used. It took a while, but the NSA says that in 2013, there were only 423 queries of that database. That doesn't sound that terrible. But that's an exception. Mostly, we don't know how this stuff has been used. We don't know what happened to the AT&T traffic on Folsom Street. We don't know how much information from Facebook and Google and others went into PRISM, the database of internet company data, and we don't know what came out the other end. We don't know how widely the NSA has deployed endpoint exploitations, and overall, we don't know how many backdoors there are, how they get installed, how often they are checked, or what they've yielded. But we do know some things we didn't before. On September 5, 2013, the New York Times and the nonprofit ProPublica jointly published stories based on Snowden documents describing Project Bull Run, a long-running effort to weaken US and international encryption standards and win access to traffic encrypted by SSL and other systems. The publication said that the effort began from the ashes of the failed Clipper chip campaign to openly require backdoor access in hardware, and that it depended on secret court orders and persuasion, as well as the subversion of standards. Now, the Clipper chip fight was a long time ago, so if you weren't around, this is what a Clipper chip looked like. I hope you weren't around back then, or you might see something a little funnier. Now, some facts were excised from the articles at the request of intelligence officials. And the first articles did not name something called the dual elliptic curve DRBG pseudo-random number generator, often known as dual EC. But they said that Snowden memos appeared to confirm that a fatal weakness discovered by 2 Microsoft engineers in 2007 was engineered by the NSA, which developed the encryption technique and got it adopted by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, which is required by statute to consult with NSA, and then by the International Organization for Standardization, which is a group of, known as ISO, which is a group so sophisticated and expert in figuring out how people should standardize things that they pick the initials, that they choose to go by the initials ISO, even though their name is the International Organization for Standards, and in fact, the initials do not track the order of the 3 words of the name of the outfit in any of its 3 official languages. But nonetheless, the NSA internal memos uncovered by the publications described the getting this adopted as a standard was, quote, a challenge in finesse. The clues in those stories were enough for cryptographers to figure out very quickly that they were talking about dual EC. It was also obvious to NIST. Less than a week later, that body, which is run by the Commerce Department, announced that it was seeking new input on whether to drop dual EC as one of 4 crypto standards it had blessed back in 2006, and that in the meantime, people should stop using it. I did not have access to the Snowden files, so I didn't have the luxury of combing through all these classified documents and picking which to make public. Note to those in government service here today, there will be one slide at the very end with classified material from Snowden, technically classified material still. I will warn you before it comes up. Instead, what I did is I looked at the few newly published documents that had just come out. I read up on dual EC, and I talked to experts. What I found most surprising was that people had been poking holes in it for years. As the Microsoft engineers Schumann and Ferguson had pointed out in 2007, whoever picked the initial constant, if they did it in a certain way, would be able to predict the output and read whatever was encrypted with dual EC. The more I looked into it, the weirder it got. Schumann and Ferguson weren't the first to say something that looked distinctly off about dual EC. Some others said they hadn't bothered to complain because they assumed that nobody would use it, especially when there were 3 other choices to get certification for some government contracts. One of the defenses that's been raised for dual EC was that whoever adopted it could pick their own constant. But if they did, then they didn't get automatic certification. Finally, it's not like dual EC had amazing other wonderful qualities that might have mitigated the fact that it could be backdoored. In fact, it was orders of magnitude slower than the other alternatives. In other words, it stunk even before it was exposed as rotten. Now, if you're a technology vendor that's gone through the trouble of getting certified for one thing or another, you tell people so that you can get hired by folks that need a certified vendor. So I found a list of tech companies reporting that they were certified for using dual EC. Knowing what I did about how lousy dual EC was at this point, I found the long list on here to be depressing. But I could still see how some company that did a ton of business with the government and companies that mimicked government requirements would want to be certified in every possible way. So then I started looking for the biggest impact of dual EC, looking at that list again. How did dual EC make its presence the most felt? Who jumped in with both feet? I went through the list again, looking for who would have played a major role in the tech ecosystem, and one company leapt out at me, a company called RSA. Now, RSA is not enormous, but it put dual EC in a toolkit that was widely used by many other companies in securing websites and communication, potentially spreading the taint very widely. And here's the thing that really struck me. It made dual EC the default. That means if you're using the RSA toolkit, you could put in some effort and pick one of the 3 other demonstrably faster, demonstrably non-backdoorable number generators. But if you just did the easy thing and went with the showroom model, you got the worst and the most suspicious of the bunch. If you're young or new to the field, you may just know RSA as the company that puts on a somewhat larger version of ShakaCon in San Francisco every year. But why did that conference, now the largest security con in the world, get started? It was to organize opposition to the US government crackdown on serious independent cryptography. It started in 1991, the same year as a proposed law to mandate backdoor access for law enforcement, which failed, setting up the Clipper chip fight. RSA's founding fathers led the fight against that chip too. You can see why. So, why was their creation, the company RSA, apparently doing more than anyone else to spread a backdoor? I spent a lot of the next 3 months trying to figure that out, and in December 2013, I published a story saying that RSA had taken $10 million in a federal contract that required it to use dual EC as the default. The crux of that story came from 2 anonymous sources, and I'm certainly not going to out them here. But I can tell you a little bit about how they came to light, because I think that might make it easier for others to do similar work, and I think this work is important. Early on in the process, I tried to come up with hypotheses about how this deal might have come to pass and who would have known about it. And I thought about the winners and losers internally and externally. Who would have been pleased about that kind of a deal, and who would have been angry at the time and after its exposure? I was looking for a specific act between specific people at a specific time, but it was critical to zoom out and learn the context. In RSA's case, and in many others, corporate structure and culture are important. RSA had been founded by 3 MIT cryptographical wizards and was initially hostile to a number of government initiatives, but it had merged with the seller of secure access tokens and was on the road to being bought by much larger storage company EMC. A key patent was expiring, and as that was happening, prestige was waning, scientific stars left, and salespeople grew relatively more important to the company. Once you know that much, it's much easier to approach people and try out theories. They're the old researchers. They're the new researchers. They're old and new salespeople. And in government, you've got people inside the agencies that are proud or chagrined, and their overseers, ditto, and perhaps other arms of government that were caught napping and woke up mad. The more research you do, the better chances you will be heard out and given a confirmation or an argument or a tip or an idea about whom to see next. I should say, too, that there are multiple ways for a backdoor to be created, and I have learned through the years that until you know which is the case, you need to adjust your reporting for all the possibilities. First, there's a straight-up appeal to patriotism from an agency to the CEO of an American company, if that CEO is American. At least pre-Snowden, I believe this is much more common than people realize. The CEO doesn't write code or make design decisions, though, so there are some fingerprints left when those commands are given. Second, there's a classified contract for goods or services that includes the special item, or an unclassified contract with a classified annex. It is important to note that this does not have to come with a capitalized and quotated notice on the back that says you now agree to help the US spy on all of your customers. Whenever possible, it just says, hey, use our random number generator, or equivalent. We need it for certification, or some internal benchmark, or so Ernie here can get a raise, or because it's classified and don't ask any more questions. This sort of a deal brings in more possible sources, including business development people specializing in government deals. Third, there can be hacking via a low-level insider, or fourth, from an outsider, or even, stay with me, of an insider by an outsider when the insider never knows what happened. Credential theft is one of the biggest sources of some of the worst breaches, right? The same is true if you want to muck with somebody's code, or just steal it for later. Fifth is the exotic stuff like intercepting packages and other supply chain hijinks that take real effort. And I'm going to leave a possible sixth final way as a question mark, a secret court order, which means there would be legal sources for what happened. The New York Times and ProPublica stories on Bull Run said the NSA effort to defeat cryptography used secret orders in addition to standard subversion. But there was little detail, and as noted, they also said the NSA used less sinister things like supercomputing power and money. Obviously, the FISA court approves specific taps, but a court-ordered backdoor has not surfaced in the Snowden cache. I've been trying to find out about any that might be there too, and I've not heard of any. My sources who reach as high as the White House have told me they don't know of any either. But it is possible that this could be one of those things where some companies get a court order and don't fight, and others get a court order and do fight. I don't have a lot of evidence I can share for that. It's just a theory, but I think it's worth exploring for a couple of reasons. One is Apple versus FBI. The Justice Department found a federal magistrate it could convince that it would not be a radical reinterpretation of a 2-century-old law to force Apple to write code that would hack into its own devices. This sort of thing typically happens under seal, but it came out this time because the government thought the light of day would be on its side. We were talking about a dead terrorist's work phone, after all. But Apple can afford some pretty good lawyers, some pretty good PR people, and the tide was going the other way when the government suddenly found a different means into the device, which unsurprisingly had nothing on it. Are there similar cases against smaller and or less feisty companies where the government has prevailed under seal? We don't know, but it seems to me that that's possible, and that's in conventional courts. What about the always closed FISA court, where company advocates are only heard if they appeal? In 2013, The Guardian reported that Microsoft had given pre-encryption access to the NSA to Outlook email. In response, Microsoft told the publication, "When we upgrade or update products, we aren't absolved from the need to comply with existing or future lawful demands." Future lawful demands. People have looked and they have not found any case law giving a legal rationale for that stance. They have to comply with future lawful demands. If they can't find case law that supports that interpretation, maybe it's because there's a secret court ruling with that interpretation, and Microsoft can't say that. It's just a theory. There's another reason, too, for this some companies are complying with orders and others aren't possibility, and that's the history of national security letters, which are these magical papers that force all kinds of access without a warrant and historically come with a gag order. Even though courts ruled that they only apply to specific types of metadata for email, including the to or from fields, some FBI agents kept sending them out to new targets with a helpful addendum listing the sorts of data that other recipients had deemed responsive. A Justice Department opinion sidestepped the issue of whether the FBI had to avoid looking at information that was voluntarily supplied to it, and attorneys involved in such cases believe that at least some smaller companies just threw up their hands and turned over everything, including email content and equivalent material. Isn't it plausible that officials could also get a secret court order that a company turn over X, even if there is no way to get X without backdooring or hacking their own products, and then sit back and watch the company squirm? The New York Times suggested that this was happening with WhatsApp a few months ago, and that might have only come out because the Facebook unit is fighting it. I do not believe that every company of every size would engage in such a battle, especially if they couldn't even claim credit in public for standing up for their customers. Speaking of the public relations aspects of all this, I want to sound a brief cautionary note about the hazards of reporting on such matters. As a journalist, you're writing about governments and companies with significant resources, and there can be serious repercussions, even if you're privileged enough to work for a large, well-funded company with the stomach for long-term investments of time and energy, and the possibility of drama with a capital D. You cannot be wrong, or you are part of the problem. And even if you're right, other things can go haywire. The LA Times did not publish my AT&T piece 10 years ago, so that didn't really help anybody. And after my first RSA story, I soon saw the best example I had ever seen of what investigative reporters call a non-denial denial. I'll put this up as a slide, but I'm also going to read it. Recent press coverage, that's not it. I was going to put it up on a slide as a slide, but now I'll just have to read it. Recent press coverage has asserted that RSA entered into a secret contract with the NSA to incorporate a known flawed random number generator into its B-safe encryption libraries. We categorically deny this allegation. That sounds pretty definitive, right? I'm in big trouble, huh? Where's the original story? Yeah, there it is. Quote, "We have worked with the NSA, both as a vendor and an active member of the security community. We have never kept this relationship a secret, and in fact have openly publicized it. Our explicit goal has always been to strengthen commercial and government security." Okay, that doesn't really say anything, except that they have contracts with the NSA and that security is good. Quote, key points about our use of dual EC GRBG in BSafe are as follows. We made the decision to use dual EC as the default in BSafe toolkits in 2004 in the context of an industry-wide effort to develop newer, stronger methods of encryption. At that time, the NSA had a trusted role in the community-wide effort to strengthen, not weaken, encryption. Okay, so yes, they used dual EC, and this certainly doesn't say it wasn't the NSA's idea. Quote, this algorithm is only one of multiple choices available within BSafe toolkits, and users have always been free to choose whichever one best suits their needs. We continued using the algorithm as an option within BSafe toolkits as it gained acceptance as the NIST standard, and because of its value in FIPS compliance. When concern surfaced about the algorithm in 2007, we continued to rely on NIST as the arbiter of that discussion. In other words, serious cryptographers said it stunk, but we stuck by it because the NIST said it was okay. Last quote. When NIST issued new guidance recommending no further use of this algorithm in September 2013, we adhered to that guidance, communicated that recommendation to customers, and discussed the change openly in the media. RSA, as a security company, never divulges details of customer engagements, but we also categorically state that we've never entered into any contract or engaged in any project with the intention of weakening RSA's products or introducing potential backdoors into our products for anyone's use. So no intentional introduction of weakness, and we don't talk about customers. Now this came out on a Sunday evening before Christmas. It sure looked like a straight denial. I had to read it 3 times before I unclinched. The first paragraph and last are the fiery denials, especially the first. No secret NSA contract to introduce a known flawed number generator. Note though, they don't mention Reuters, or me personally. Certainly after my article came out, a lot of other media wrote about it quickly, and some got key facts wrong, including several who asserted that we had written that RSA knowingly backdoored its software. So they could just be denying those stories and perhaps not minding if people interpreted it as denying mine as well. Let's look at the details. They're not denying that dual EC was bad. They're not denying that they had an NSA contract. They're not even denying that they adopted dual EC because of a $10 million secret contract. If all of those things are actually true, how could they say they did not have a secret NSA contract to include a known flawed number generator? I believe the answer is in the word known. That word could be read 2 ways. The most straightforward way would indicate that dual EC is now known to be flawed. But after reading it a 3rd time, I saw there was another way to read the sentence, that RSA did not know that dual EC was flawed then. I'll read it one last time. Recent press coverage has asserted that RSA entered into a secret contract with the NSA to incorporate a known flawed random number generator into its BSafe encryption libraries. Again, I never wrote that RSA knew it was a backdoor at the time. Given what I learned about the cultural change at the company, I believed it was plausible that those who approved the deal did not know. Many geniuses and cynics were gone. I suggested as much in the original article, quoting one former employee familiar with the deal as saying of the government side, quote, they did not show their true hand. You might say that I am torturing the meaning of the word known. I would prefer calling it enhanced interrogation. But imagine your company's integrity or intelligence, and certainly its efficacy, had been attacked by the most distributed news service on the planet, and then that was stretched further by many others. You took 48 hours to respond. And then, if you had the opportunity to simply and truthfully tell the public that you had not accepted a federal contract to use a number generator most people see as an NSA backdoor, why in the name of all that is holy would you not do that? Despite the intricacies of all this and the Sunday night timing, a majority of the media actually got it right. A number of other major outlets, such as the BBC, falsely reported that RSA had denied my story, and they did not correct that when contacted. So when people complain to me about the media, I listen. There's one broader point I want to make here. You folks and a lot of the public now realize that the intelligence agencies and their contractors spend a lot of time looking for flaws in software. You should also understand that they devote similar energy to looking for holes in the law and in language. They see it as part of the same mission, what General Hayden in his most recent book called Playing to the Edge. The strident non-denial denial was not the end of the RSA story. F-Secure Chief Research Officer Mikko Hipponen and at least 8 other speakers at RSA canceled their talks, and several spoke instead at a spontaneously created new rival called TrustyCon. In March 2014, that's not there either. Told you I wasn't a visual guy. In March 2014, I reported that a team of academics from Johns Hopkins, the University of Wisconsin, the University of Illinois, and elsewhere had found that RSA had not only adopted dual EC, but they had used a second, even less widely known tool developed at NSA's Information Assurance Directorate called Extended Random that exacerbated the RSA software's vulnerability. It made a version of BSafe crackable tens of thousands of times faster. Quote, "We could have been more skeptical of the NSA's intentions," RSA Chief Technologist Sam Curry told me. "We trusted them because they are charged with the security for the U.S. government and U.S. critical infrastructure." Curry declined to say if the government had paid RSA to incorporate extended random. Which brings me to another source of optimism for those trying to root out backdoors. Government elements have more money and probably more experts on their side, certainly when you include their corporate allies. But on the other side, you have whistleblowers in government and the private sector, you have journalists, and you have this big third flank, the academics and other security researchers like yourselves, including some who worked for companies that have been compromised or that are rivals to companies that have been compromised. There's a fourth vector as well, the wild card of geopolitics. Some security firms are seeing themselves more allied with their home governments and are therefore incented to look for problems in other countries. The research community, some of which feels betrayed by NSA, has done some amazing work. Great papers came out on dual EC and extended random, and they would do the same for the last set of backdoors I want to talk about at Juniper Networks. Last December, that company put out an extremely unusual announcement, just 4 paragraphs before a brief Q&A, which was prepackaged, and the crux was this. Quote, "During a recent internal code review, Juniper discovered unauthorized code in ScreenOS that would allow a knowledgeable attacker to gain administrative access to NetScreen devices and to crypt VPN. Once we identified these vulnerabilities, we launched an investigation into the matter, worked to develop and issue patches for the latest versions of ScreenOS." Now, ScreenOS is not Junos, but it controls some VPN products and firewalls. With so many vulnerabilities identified, patched every day, there's a real risk that an announcement like this will get missed. But fortunately, more people know what to look for, and they'll speak with each other and speak up. Unauthorized code is an amazing admission, in case you ever see it again. It's not just a flaw in a program. This is something that was not supposed to be there. It was not authorized to be there. People saw that, they started digging further, asking questions, and reverse engineering the patches. And it emerged that there were 2 separate things. There was an SSH backdoor, and there was also a change in a constant in some other program. And show of hands, who knows what the change in what the constant was changed in? Anybody? Dual elliptic curve. Further work showed that the change had been made in 2012, which is before Snowden made dual EC famous. That the original implementation of dual EC in NetScreen was in 2008. Now, a bunch of other changes, as with RSA, there were a bunch of other code changes at the same time that made dual EC work as a better backdoor, and there was some obfuscation. For example, there was a different random number generator that was also used in tandem with it, but there's an exception that says that other non-tainted random number generator wouldn't always be invoked. And in fact, that turned out to be in every single case that the program ran. So that random number generator never came into play at all. It's very impressive to me what happened in less than a month after the initial announcement, which is that Juniper then pulled all of dual EC instead of just putting it back the way it was in 2008 after the exposure. That was really encouraging to me. I asked General Hayden this spring what he thought about Nobus's, which are nobody but us capabilities that only the US can exploit. And he said he's lost a lot of faith in the ability of Nobus's to stay Nobus. We don't know a lot about what happened at Juniper still. But if the NSA indirectly or directly put in dual EC, got it put in, and then that was converted by some outside party, then that is a pretty compelling argument against Nobus. Now, what can we do? If you don't think Nobuses are a good idea? What can be done about them? The simplest answer would be to change US policy. It's subject to regular reviews and verifiable. That could protect American companies and actually help their users and actually help those companies abroad, unless the other countries follow suit and also make similar verifiable pledges not to backdoor anything. If it sounds crazy that the US would forswear backdooring, please consider that the blue ribbon panel appointed by the White House in Snowden's wake recommended that the government do exactly that, at least for core encryption. Here we are beginning on page 216 of the President's Review Group on Intelligence and Communications Technologies. We recommend that the US government fully support and not undermine efforts to create encryption standards, not in any way subvert, undermine, weaken, or make vulnerable generally available commercial software, and increase the use of encryption. The government should make it clear that the NSA will not engineer vulnerabilities into encryption algorithms that guard global commerce or demand changes in any product by any vendor for the purpose of undermining the security or integrity of the product, or to ease NSA's clandestine collection of information by users of the product. The White House has adopted many of the panel's recommendations, but not that one, but that could be changed. Even that probably wouldn't get us everywhere, because technically it wouldn't be the NSA demanding changes, it would be a court. And this says nothing about lucrative contracts or patriotic persuasion. So even if the White House flip-flops, we would need a commitment from vendors, like a triple your money back sort of guarantee, which could conceivably happen if big buyers jump up and down and demand it. Tools that would help this process include third-party code audits and more rigorous processes for committing code. Another thing that would help, and this works in the short term as well, is good old-fashioned embarrassment. One of the scarier slides to come out of the Snowden files was this one, and if you have a clearance, I believe this is when you're supposed to avert your eyes, or at least do deep breathing exercises. This shows the requested annual budget 3 years ago for computer network signals intelligence enabling was $255 million. Backdoors are a big part of that, along with influencing cryptography standards. And there are other pieces too, such as collecting what's available from cooperative carriers and analyzing foreign trusted systems for flaws. But still, $255 million. Recall that the RSA contract was for a mere $10 million. The vast majority of backdoors have not been uncovered. But the RSA and Juniper experiences also make clear that there are real penalties for companies when they do get found out. So if you think that fewer companies should make such deals, one good way to move toward that goal is to help identify the other participants in such programs. As I said before, there's a shared interest among researchers who are inclined in this direction, whistleblowers, and journalists like myself. So if you belong to one of the first two groups and are interested in making contact with the third, here's my favorite slide, how to get a hold of me. For the rest of you, I'm looking forward to your questions. Thanks very much. Come on. Really? Yes, in the back. Oh, thank you. That's very nice. I appreciate it.
Do you think any of these supply chain security efforts are going to address any government-imposed backdoors? The notion of from the fab straight to the product and making sure that the chain of custody is preserved?
Who's running the efforts in question? If it's a DoD-sponsored supply chain thing, which is what I think has the longest tenure, maybe. You know, while it's been sort of deprecated, it seems to me, the NSA has a really important defensive mission. And if General Hayden's opinion that maybe this Nobis thing is less countable on than it used to be, I could see them doing really good stuff on there. But that would be for DoD stuff and their suppliers, and it's going to take a long time to fan out elsewhere. And I think there's deliberate vulnerabilities everywhere, to say nothing of accidental vulns. Yeah?
How confident are you that you've been backdoored at home?
Me personally?
Yeah.
Well, my first rule of OPSEC is not to talk about my OPSEC, but I take pretty serious precautions. I mean, me against a nation state is a really screwed up situation, let alone multiple nation states, mob members, anonymous, and whoever else I've pissed off. But I don't write the really key stuff down electronically, names of my sources. I don't write that down. Thank you. Anybody else before they drag me off here? No? Okay, thanks very much.